1903, a picture-perfect family frozen in time, forcing smiles before the lens of a primitive camera. At first glance, it's ordinary, a typical portrait of the Victorian era. But look closer, much closer, and you'll begin to notice what investigators of the time chose to overlook. Because sometimes the real horror doesn't lurk outside the home. It hides within. Imagine for a moment that you're holding that photograph yourself. The paper is brittle, edges frayed with age, its surface faded to a pale sepia. You study the serious faces, the rigid postures, the awkwardly polite smiles that were customary for the age, and you think to yourself, what a respectable family. But what if I told you that behind those polite smiles lies one of the darkest secrets in recorded history? That every figure in that photograph was concealing a horror that no smile could truly mask. The year 1903 was an age of transformation. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped society. Cities were swelling, technology was advancing, and the rhythms of everyday life were shifting in ways people had never experienced before. Photography, still a relatively new invention, had quickly become a household fascination, finally allowing ordinary families to preserve their likeness for future generations. Cameras, once costly instruments reserved for wealthy professionals, were now creeping into the lives of the growing middle class. But with this novelty came unease. Old fears took new forms and superstition soon followed. People whispered that cameras didn't just capture appearances, they trapped fragments of the soul, lingering memories, and even unseen spirits that lived beyond the reach of human sight. It is against this backdrop that our story unfolds in Millbrook, a quaint village tucked away in the rolling hills of the English countryside, a postcard-perfect place where every family name had appeared in the parish records for generations, where scandal never rose above gossip about the baker's bread or a courtship whispered in pews. A place where nothing remarkable was ever supposed to happen, until the Hartwells decided to take a family photograph. That photograph, unearthed in 1987 by a historian combing through the dust-caked archives of the local police, was the only surviving relic of what contemporary newspapers carefully called the Hartwell incident, a vague and polite phrase that barely scratched the surface of the true nightmare, because the sealed police files told a far different story, one that had been deliberately hidden for nearly a century. Thomas Hartwell, 42, was a man of stature in Millbrook. The well-liked owner of a thriving hardware store on the high street, he supplied everything from farming tools to imported machinery from London. His neighbors knew him as reliable, charitable, and fair, a man whose word carried weight. His wife, Margaret, 38, was equally respected. Once a teacher, she had dedicated herself to raising their children and serving the parish with tireless devotion. She organized charity drives, visited the sick, and carried herself with a dignity that inspired admiration. Their 3 children completed the portrait of perfection. 16-year-old Elizabeth, bright and well-read, played piano with grace and carried ambitions of becoming a teacher or even a writer. James, just 12, was endlessly curious about mechanics, gadgets, and the workings of the modern world. And little Mary, only 7, with her golden curls and innocent laughter, was beloved not just by her parents, but by the entire village. By every account of the time, the Hartwells were a family to be admired, the very image of virtue. And yet, a letter discovered decades later, one Margaret wrote to her sister in Boston, casts a long, unsettling shadow over this picture of domestic bliss. The letter, penned in Margaret's delicate script just 2 weeks before the photograph was taken, begins innocently enough. Dearest Sarah, I pray this letter finds you in good health. Forgive my silence these past weeks, but things in our home have become strange. Margaret goes on to describe Thomas's return from a business trip to London. Something about him had changed. He was always a quiet man, she admitted, but now his silence felt unnatural. He spent long hours locked away in his study, poring over unfamiliar papers, emerging only to pace the halls deep into the night. His footsteps are heavy, Margaret wrote, measured, deliberate. When I speak to him, he only stares, not with anger nor sorrow, but with something far worse, as though he were looking through me, as though I did not exist at all. The children, too, had noticed. Elizabeth wondered aloud if her father had fallen ill. James avoided him entirely, and Mary had begun to scream in her sleep. Night after night she woke in terror, insisting that a man was in the house. "A man who looks like father," she cried, "but is not father." But the most chilling part of the letter was still to come. Margaret confessed that in the early hours she often heard voices in the cellar, low, murmuring voices she could not make out. "At first I thought it must be Thomas speaking to himself," she wrote, "but whenever I descend, the basement is empty. And the voices, Sarah, the voices are not his. There are many, too many. As if an entire gathering were taking place in our cellar, but with no one there." September 13th, 1903. A quiet Sunday in Millbrook. The golden light of late summer draped the town. Parishioners streamed out of the stone church, chatting idly about Reverend Watson's sermon, making plans for supper. No one suspected that, at that very moment, the Hartwells were arranging something that would ensure their names were forever whispered in fear. The local photographer, Henry Blackwood, received a peculiar request that week. Thomas Hartwell had visited his studio, asking for a family portrait to be taken that Sunday. The request itself was common enough. But something about Thomas's manner unsettled Henry deeply. Blackwood, now in his mid-40s and with over 2 decades of experience, had an eye for detail. He was a man who noticed the little things, expressions, movements, the kind of subtleties that often went unspoken. And from the moment Thomas Hartwell made that request, Henry sensed something was terribly wrong. From the crude experiments of the daguerreotype to the more advanced techniques of his day, Henry Blackwood prided himself on capturing not only the faces of his clients, but something of their very essence. His portraits were praised throughout the region, admired not just for their sharpness, but for the uncanny way they seemed to reveal character. Blackwood also had a meticulous habit. He kept a diary of every session. Notebooks filled with careful notes, technical details like plates, exposure times and light conditions, but also his private impressions, observations of the atmosphere in the room, and any peculiarities that struck him during the work. These journals, preserved decades later in a trunk donated to the local archives after his death, held something extraordinary. The entry about his session with the Hartwells began with the same steady hand as all the others, but as the writing progressed, the letters themselves grew jagged, frantic, as though the man recording them was unraveling while he wrote. Sunday, September 13th, 1903. Family sitting at the Hartwell residence. Blackwood arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, hauling his camera equipment by wagon. The Hartwell home had always stood out in Millbrook, a handsome stone house framed by immaculate gardens. But on that day, something felt wrong. From the moment he stepped onto the property, he sensed an oppressive stillness. Perhaps it was the silence in a household with 3 children, or perhaps the way the curtains were drawn tight against the bright September sun. Whatever it was, the air itself seemed heavy. Thomas answered the door. Normally genial, always ready with a handshake and a story, he was oddly formal, almost mechanical. His replies to Blackwood's questions were brief nods, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret was pale and restless, her hands trembling as she greeted him. She smiled politely, but it was the sort of smile that barely conceals exhaustion, the kind one wears when all strength is nearly spent. The children were more unsettling still. Elizabeth, only 16, looked hollow-eyed as if she hadn't slept for days. When Blackwood tried to speak to her about her books, she nodded but stared at the floor, lips pressed shut. James, usually brimming with questions about the camera, sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. When asked what he was watching, he muttered, "Nothing," and quickly looked away. And little Mary, the golden-haired child Blackwood had photographed before, now clutched her porcelain doll so tightly her knuckles whitened. When Blackwood approached, she recoiled, whispering something to the doll as though confiding in it rather than speaking to him. And then came the most disturbing exchange. As Blackwood adjusted his tripod, Thomas stepped close, so close that the photographer could feel his breath against his ear. In a low, urgent whisper, Thomas said, "Mr. Blackwood, whatever happens during this session, no matter what you see or hear, keep the camera steady. The photograph must be taken. It is very important." When Blackwood turned, startled, Thomas's eyes revealed a terror beyond words, a mix of desperation, dread, and something else. Resignation, as if he knew that something terrible was already in motion, something unstoppable. Before retreating to his place beside Margaret, Thomas added even softer, "If anything goes wrong, if something happens to us, make sure this photograph is seen. Someone must know the truth." Those words haunted Blackwood for the rest of his life. At 3:15, he began the exposure. Thomas and Margaret seated at the center, the children arranged carefully around them. 15 seconds. That was the length required to capture a sharp image in the dim light. 15 seconds of utter stillness. He reminded them of this, and they obeyed with a rigidity that seemed almost unnatural. At first, all appeared normal. Forced smiles, stiff posture, the typical look of Victorian portraiture. But within moments, Blackwood's trained ear caught it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pacing across the upper floor. The sound of boots moving slowly toward the staircase. He glanced at Thomas, expecting some acknowledgement. Instead, he saw sweat breaking across the man's brow despite the cool weather. Margaret trembled, her gloved hands tightening in her lap until the lace strained against her knuckles. Thomas's fists clenched, veins standing out against his skin, his jaw rigid. And in his eyes was not irritation, not embarrassment, but raw, animal terror, the look of someone cornered. The footsteps halted at the top of the stairs leading to the very room where they sat. Silence fell, a silence so complete that even the tick of the wall clock seemed to die away. Then came the whisper, a voice, low and guttural, threading through the walls. It was not a voice Blackwood recognized, nor one that belonged to any of the Hartwells. The sound seemed to come not from a person, but from the house itself. The words were in no tongue he knew, yet the cadence carried menace, each syllable vibrating with something ancient and wrong. Elizabeth, who had been so composed until then, began to weep. Silent tears slid down her cheeks even as she forced the same strained smile, as though her face had been frozen into place and the exposure was still running. It was one of the most unsettling things Henry Blackwood had ever witnessed. Elizabeth, smiling stiffly for the camera, while tears slid silently down her face. A child's forced grin masking pure terror, James had shut his eyes tight, as though he could block not only the sight, but the very sounds and sensations pressing in around them. His lips moved without voice, forming the same words again and again. Blackwood realized he was praying, whispering the same desperate plea like a mantra for protection. But it was little Mary's behavior that would haunt him most. Slowly, with a stillness that seemed unnatural, she turned her head toward him. Her blue eyes locked onto his, and though no sound escaped her lips, he clearly saw the words she mouthed, "He's not Daddy anymore." Every instinct screamed at Blackwood to abandon his equipment, to flee that house and never look back. Yet Thomas's earlier warning rang in his mind. The photograph must be taken no matter what. And so, with shaking hands, he kept the lens exposed, forcing himself to complete the session. The whispers above them went on for a few seconds longer, then stopped, swallowed by silence. The heavy footsteps receded with the same slow deliberation, fading into the unseen rooms upstairs. Yet even after the sounds were gone, the sense of a presence remained. It was as though something invisible still hovered in the house, watching every move. At last, the 15 seconds elapsed. Blackwood replaced the cap on the lens, ending the exposure. Instantly, the Hartwells' rigid postures broke, not with relief, but with the slack exhaustion of people who had just endured something unbearable. Their faces sagged, their bodies trembled, and for a moment no one spoke. Blackwood packed his equipment in silence, his movements mechanical, fueled only by the desperate urge to leave. But before he could depart, Thomas crossed the room to him one final time. For just a moment, it was as though the true Thomas Hartwell resurfaced, the genial man Henry had known for years. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice unsteady, "when you develop this photograph, remember, we are not always what we appear, and not everything we see is all that is truly present." He paused, glancing back at Margaret and the children, who sat silently as if already fading from life. Then he added, If anything happens to us, if we are not here when you return with the picture, make sure the authorities see it. Someone must know we tried to leave evidence." Shaken to his core, Blackwood left the Hartwell residence, hands trembling as he guided his wagon home. All the way back to his studio, Thomas's words echoed in his ears, mingling with the memory of those haunted eyes. The Hartwells had been expecting something terrible, and whatever it was, they knew they could not escape. That night, Blackwood developed the plate. A process he had performed thousands of times now felt like a descent into nightmare. At first, the image was ordinary enough, a stiff Victorian family, frozen in their Sunday best. But as the details sharpened in the chemical bath, Henry's stomach clenched. At first it was the shadows, too many of them, stretched at wrong angles, detached from the family, as though moving of their own will. Several bore the faint outlines of human figures, bodies that should not exist. Then came the reflections. In the mirror behind them, in the window glass, even in the sheen of the children's eyes, he saw it. The figure of a sixth person. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in period clothing, but its posture was wrong. Its placement in each reflection was inconsistent, as though it existed in several overlapping realities at once. And then Blackwood saw Thomas's face. What he had assumed during the session was a forced smile was in truth a rictus of horror. The photograph had frozen every strained muscle, every line of panic etched across his features. His eyes were wide, staring at something just beyond the frame, staring at a point directly behind the camera, where Blackwood himself had stood. The truth struck him with ice-cold clarity. He had not been alone in that room. Someone, or something, had been standing directly behind him for the entire exposure. The Hartwells had seen it. He had not. Henry spent the rest of the night in torment, comparing the image to others he had taken in the same house. No logical explanation could hold. He was certain now. His camera had captured something beyond human understanding. At dawn, determined to deliver the photograph and demand an explanation, he returned to the Hartwell home. But the house was silent, locked, curtains drawn, circling the property. Dread tightened his chest. Several windows were shattered, but the glass lay outside on the ground, blown outward as though the family had tried to escape. In the garden, the soil was gouged with deep drag marks, as if furniture or bodies had been hauled across the earth. He hurried to the sheriff. At first, Jonathan Mills dismissed it as a misunderstanding. The Hartwells must have taken an unannounced trip, perhaps to visit relatives. But when investigators forced entry later that day, they found no family, no luggage, and no trace of a planned departure. What they did find was worse. Inside, the rooms were in shambles, furniture overturned, dishes shattered, signs of desperate barricades at interior doors. The walls bore long, ragged scratches, claw marks that no tool could easily explain, as though something had tried to crawl up from the very floors. And the locks. Every lock in the house, both on the doors and the windows, was secured from the inside. Keys lay in their places. The broken windows were too small for escape. The Hartwell family had vanished from a house that was sealed shut. It was as if the Hartwells had been swallowed whole, vanished from within a house locked from the inside, with no possible way out and no trace of where they had gone. Inspector Charles Whitman, a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience, took charge of the case. Pragmatic and skeptical by nature, Whitman had seen his share of rural crimes, but nothing prepared him for what was hidden in the Hartwells' cellar. Descending into the basement, investigators found an environment that had clearly been used recently, though not for any purpose they could identify. Circles had been drawn into the packed earth floor with a mixture later identified as chalk and salt. Within these chalk rings lay objects that belonged to the family: clothing scraps, locks of hair, small household items, arranged in strange, deliberate patterns that defied all logic. But the most disturbing discovery was the footprints, human-like impressions embedded in the dirt floor. They were enormous, larger than Thomas Hartwell's size 43 boots, and warped, as though they belonged to something that didn't quite walk in a natural way. Stranger still, the prints didn't form a continuous path. Instead, they appeared in random spots across the cellar, as though the figure that made them had the ability to materialize instantly in different places. Whitman, ever the rationalist, tried to explain what he saw. Yet in his private notes, found decades later among his personal papers, he confessed to a haunting conclusion. He believed he had stumbled upon something beyond human comprehension. In the margin of one report, written in his own uneasy hand, was a chilling line. The footprints were too large to belong to any family member, and too unnatural to belong to any man. Henry Blackwood, the photographer, never touched a camera again. He lived out his remaining years tormented by the memory of that photograph, obsessed with the idea that it had captured something not meant for human eyes. When he died in 1934, a sealed envelope was found among his belongings, bearing strict instructions: do not open for 50 years. In 1984, archivists finally unsealed it. Inside were two things: a second copy of the Hartwell family portrait, and a letter that revealed the most terrible truth of all. The second photograph was almost identical to the first, except for one horrifying difference. The figure that had appeared only in reflections in the original image was now plainly visible, standing directly behind the family. A tall, broad figure in Victorian dress, its face unmistakably inhuman. Blackwood's letter explained, "To whoever finds this letter." I took 2 photographs that day. The first revealed what human eyes could see. The second revealed what was truly there. Thomas Hartwell died 3 weeks earlier in London. What returned to Millbrook was not him. The family knew. They smiled for the camera because they had no choice, and I discovered it too late to save them, but not too late to leave this warning. If you ever sense that those around you are no longer themselves, if you see them smiling when every instinct says they should be afraid, look closer. Because sometimes what smiles back at you is not human. The Hartwell case remains unsolved to this day. Theories have flourished. Some claim the family fell victim to a doppelganger, a supernatural double that wears the face of the dead. Others connect it to similar disappearances in the region, families who were last seen smiling, outwardly normal, before vanishing without trace. But the most disturbing theory is the simplest, that the truth is beyond us. That what happened in Millbrook was too vast, too terrible, for the human mind to ever fully understand. The Hartwell house still stands. Today it serves as a local museum, and on permanent display in the very room where it was taken hangs the photograph. Visitors often describe a strange sensation when they gaze at it. The uncanny feeling that the image itself is staring back, and if you look closely, very closely, you can still make out a shadow in the glass, a reflection that shouldn't be there. A figure that doesn't belong, a figure that is smiling. This has been one of history's most chilling mysteries, buried in dust and silence for over a century. If this investigation unsettled you, subscribe so you never miss the next case. Tell me, do you believe photographs can capture more than just images? Have you ever seen something in an old photo that made your blood run cold? Leave your story in the comments below. Until next time, remember, not everything we see is all that is truly there.